Our second lesson comes from Paul's letter to the Colossians in the 3rd chapter. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in the one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. All thanks and praise be to God for his word. May God add to our hearing this day his blessing, his wisdom, that we may understand more deeply. Amen. Back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, I had just arrived at the church, Trinity Church in Palm Coast, as the new pastor in 1997. And Palm Coast was on the verge of great growth at that point in time, and the next few years would really grow exponentially. And so when I got there, it was still a little bit of the smaller community that had begun, but it was already starting to break out and grow. And because it was this new community, there were some original churches that had begun when Palm Coast began. And they were pretty much the mainliners. Roman Catholic Church was there. The Trinity Presbyterian was one of the originals. The local Lutheran Church was an original. And the AME Church was an original. And the Baptist Church was an original. And that was pretty much what was there upon my arrival. And then there were some churches outside of Palm Coast that were part of our ministerial, but they weren't in town. But as time wore on, in the early 2000s, something began to really happen. Something began to pop. All of a sudden, there was this outbreak. And I remember, I mentioned it to some people because it seemed like it happened like overnight. All of a sudden, there was this outbreak of non-denominational churches. And they were like meeting everywhere. They were meeting in school auditoriums. They were meeting in movie theaters. They had all kinds of different kinds of names. You know, nothing that sounded like Presbyterian or Lutheran. You know, it was Church of the Excited or whatever it was. It had a name that was very, very modern and contemporary. And their style, of course, in worship was very different than our Presbyterian style or any of the mainline styles. I mean, it was contemporary worship. So they were in an auditorium somewhere or a movie theater, and they had a band, and they had words on the screen, and it was all new and different, and it's something that traditionalists like me have never seen before. We wonder, oh my gosh, Jesus must be coming back because this is getting weird. Well, anyway, and they kept saying that, you know, this was the birth of non-denominational churches. Fine. A non-denominational church being a church that didn't have the history we had, that came out of the Reformation and all that stuff that happened in Europe. This was different. These were non-denominational churches. But really what we were witnessing, and after a few years of watching this develop and grow, this wasn't just happening in Palm Coast, of course. It was happening all over the place. And what you began to realize, though, as time went on, was that this was not the birth of non-denominational churches, although they like to call themselves that. This was the birth of entirely new denominations in America. Because they started out with names like the Vineyard. There's one here in town. There was one that started in Palm Coast long before that. There was a church called the Calvary Church. There was the Willow Creek Church. There was a church called the Riverside Church. And as I began to drive around Florida on different visits, going to the hospitals, different towns, and things like that, I began to see signs for the same kinds of non-denominational churches that were springing up in Palm Coast. I thought, well, what a coincidence. They named their church the same thing. Well, yeah, it was a coincidence because what was happening was these churches were becoming denominations unto themselves. They had a mothership somewhere, and they were satelliting themselves out all over the country. And with modern technology, these churches, going by the same name, in essence became denominational churches for that mothership. And they were connected by modern technology, by satellite dishes, and by all kinds of stuff, so that when you were in worship, not only were you in worship watching the preacher who was there, you were watching the preacher of preachers who was the head of the church at some headquarters in a big city, and you got to watch that preacher preach at you live, and then the preacher in the auditorium would get up and follow up on that. And so these were becoming brand new denominations unto themselves. I remember that as the numbers of mainline churches began to decrease, and that began really right around the time that I was graduating from seminary and becoming a minister, numbers in the mainline churches began to drop, slow decline, and that's continued to this time. The question that a lot of us mainliners would ask is, are we in need of a new reformation? And what prompted the question was, the thing we were talking about is, do we need somehow to reconfigure, to change what has been known as the institutional church? Because quite frankly, the numbers are showing us it's not going in our direction. It's changing, and it's changing radically. And we thought at the time, in the early 2000s, we thought the church was going the whole non-denominational route. Well, that didn't turn out to be quite so, because they're not growing any more than anybody else is. There's just a lot of rearranging of the deck chairs going on. Because you see, yes, we're constantly in need of a new reformation. Our Presbyterian theology teaches us that the Reformation is always ongoing. We have to take that seriously. It's not just one moment in time and then everything changes and we got to be that way. That we are being reformed every day. And that we must have such a spirit in Christ that we are reforming ourselves on a constant basis, because the world is always changing. And we have to, as a church and as a faithful people, live up to the changes that are going on in the world and be relevant to what the world is saying and doing here and now. So it wasn't a matter of a new reformation, a new point in time where everything changes. It's not about that. Because Reformation doesn't happen that way. Reformation doesn't happen because a group of people decide something's got to change and they change it. Reformation happens because something happens from the grassroots of faithful people, and it bubbles up and it changes the topography of the church. It changes everything about us, and it had nothing to do with people making a decision to change. It had to do with something that just had to be. That's what happened with the Reformation in the 1500s. People had just had enough of the institution of the church they had known for centuries. And they needed a change. And change came. And the Luthers and the Calvins and the Zwinglies of the day caught that tide and went with it. But it was coming without them. There would have been someone else if they were around. Because the grassroots faithful were saying, something's got to change, because it's not about faith anymore. It's about the fact that the institution has taken us over. And being the people, the community of faith of Jesus Christ, is not about being directed and controlled by institution. When the institution no longer serves that purpose, then the institution has to change or it has to go. Now, the reason I'm talking about all this is because back in May, the Pew Research Center came out with a new poll that it hadn't done since 2007 called America's Changing Religious Landscape. And back in May, I was going to read that, but I didn't have time. I finally got to sit down and read it in the last couple of weeks. It's 200 pages long, and most of those pages are charts and graphs, and I like to read the narrative more than I do all the charts and graphs. I'm not a statistician, but at any rate, it's an interesting read, and I want to show you some things about it. First thing I want to show you is this, and this, the title is a little cut off there, but it's about the decline of the U.S. church, and the Christian church and other things, and it shows that unaffiliated and those who call themselves nothing in particular, there's where the sermon title comes from, folks, are a growing number. And so look at that chart for a minute. There's a lot of numbers there, and you don't need to dwell on too much of it, except for the fact that if you look over in the far right column where it says percent of change, what you're going to see is Christianity is dropping, and then the breakdown of all the different denominations, Protestant and Catholic, and you can see they're showing drops, okay, in participation and membership. But now look at the underlined unaffiliated, and that's a major category, unaffiliated. The unaffiliated ranks from 2007 to 2014 have grown by plus 6.7% in this country. Those, and then you can see how it breaks down, the atheists and agnostics, and there's been a little growth there. And then look at nothing in particular. The people who say they are nothing in particular, plus 3.7. If you look at that whole chart, that's the fastest growing category in America today. Now let's look at the next slide. If you look at this slide, basically what that's showing us is that is the same thing that we saw in the last slide, in which the drops are all happening. But if you look all the way down the left-hand column to 16.1, and you look at that blue line, that's the unaffiliated ranks, and look how that's jumping as others are declining. Now, other faiths down below has grown because there's more immigrants coming to the United States and not coming as Christians as much anymore. And so there's a growth in other faiths just because of immigration and the influx of people coming from other parts of the world. Whereas immigrants used to come from Europe, they're coming from elsewhere, and they're bringing with them different religions. But as you can see, the growing number is marked unaffiliated. Now let's look at the next slide. Nothing in particular means this, okay, just so we can define what a category means when people say nothing in particular. First of all, it's one of two groups. Those who no longer identify with a particular religious faith, that's part of that number, no longer identify as being part of a religious faith. Secondly, they identify themselves as followers of religious faith, not a particular one, but of a religious faith in general, but maintain no affiliation with an organized religion. Between 1 and 2, those unaffiliated ranks, those nothing in particular, are growing faster than any other segment in our society. Now, nothing in particulars differ from atheists and agnostics because atheists and agnostics intentionally do not identify with a religious tradition. They say, we're not religious. And then number 2, nothing in particulars are simply choosing not to affiliate. And that comes from the ranks of those who were once affiliated, but it also is coming from the ranks mostly of the millennial generation who are not dialing in. But that also includes some baby boomers and Gen Xers who are dialing out. Okay? So that's the changing landscape of our faith, and it's confusing to an institutional church. because we think in terms of institution. And when we think of answers to try to overcome the challenges that we face, we think in institutional ways. But what the poll is telling us is that people are moving away from identifying institutions as the way that they're going to have faith in their lives. Well, of course, the big question is, well, then how are they going to have it? And I think that's open-ended. We don't know how that's going to transpire in the future, but what we know is what people are saying about their loyalty to institution. And it's changing. I actually saw this when I first started in ministry. The church I went to was in a small town, and it was the Mecca of Mason lodges in Kansas. They were the best Masonic lodge in Kansas for years and years and years in a row. Nobody could beat them. They were the best Masonic lodge, and they always played it up big. Every male in my congregation was a Mason. And when you're the pastor of a church full of Masons, they want you to be a Mason too. And Masons weren't supposed to recruit openly, but they did. And they wanted me to be a Mason, and I resisted. I didn't want to join that organization. I didn't want to join any organization. I didn't want to join the Lions. I didn't want to join the JCs. I didn't want to join any of these civic-type groups. And I had no reason why, except I just didn't want to. And that, of course, was coming out of my baby boomer generation. Because we were a generation, maybe the first generation to come along, that didn't want to join these things. At least my segment of baby boomers didn't want to join stuff anymore. And these civic groups were begging for us. And we weren't joining. And I never joined. I've never joined a civic group in my life. Simply because I haven't wanted to. Sorry about that, but that's how it is. And I have no good reason for it except I don't want to. Well, I examined that. I realized that that's the way I felt. And I looked at that at that age, and I said to myself, I remember saying to myself in my 20s, you know, if my generation isn't joining the civic groups like they used to anymore, big change between my generation and the one that came before me. And we're not joining these institutions anymore. It's just a matter of time. The same thing is going to happen to the church. I said that in 1982, folks. It is now 2015, and what I thought back then is coming true in American society today. I saw it coming because I saw what was happening to the other organizations before the church. But there was a loyalty to the church that was going to take a while to get away from in society, and that's happening. And so anyway, with or without us, the new Reformation is happening. And it's being driven by what we call the nothing in particulars. And we don't have a clear definition as to who they are or what they think faith is. And these are trends that aren't going to change, which means the church is now challenged to ask the question, what does this mean? And if a lot of the nothing in particular, not all, but if a lot of them are still people who believe in spirituality and having faith, but they don't believe in the institution anymore, what are we to do with the institution? And that's a big question, and I don't have any answers for you today, so you're going to walk out disappointed. I have no answers for you. If I did, I'd be in charge of the entire church, I guess, but I'm not. I have no answers. But I know it's the biggest question we're going to face as a church in the decades to come. What is faith without an institution? Or what does it mean to recraft the institution to be responsive to people who are no longer going to be loyalists to the institution? Those are big questions. And I don't think the church has really addressed them well yet. We have tried. Over my 35 years of ministry, I've watched a lot of church fads come and go. And I hate fads. And I can spot one when it's coming down the road. And I say, this is a fad, and sure enough, it is a fad. Fads don't address the deeper question of faith. They look for another way. They look for ways to change up the institution and make it look differently. But it's still a fad. Now, all is not lost, folks. Okay? All is not lost. Because at the heart of the matter, at the heart of the faith of our church, and at the heart of the faith of the nothings in particular, or nothing in particular, at the heart of both, there is, in essence, there is an essential message that we must hear. And that essential message is summed up for us very powerfully in Paul's letter to the Colossians. So listen to these words again. As God's chosen, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another and forgive each other, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. You know, there's nothing in there about joining an institution. Although Paul was an institutional man, he founded the early church, and he did deal with problems they had and told them the rules and regulations. But even though Paul had to do that, be an institutional man sometimes, there are places in his writings where it comes out loud and clear what this is all about. And it's not about institution, and it's not about your rules and regulations, and it's not about the petty and the minor divisions that you have with each other and deciding how to separate yourselves from each other. It is about this. It is about being holy and beloved. It's about clothing yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. That was important for Paul, because if you didn't have that, it didn't matter what kind of institution you were in. It'd be nothing more than a worldly institution. Because devotion to rule and regulation and to standards of behavior are but human constructs that keep us going. As humans, we always need to have institution. We can't avoid it. You get two people together who decide on something and they're going to do it together, they've created an institution. If they keep it going. But what Paul was saying was, at the heart of the matter is the peace of Christ that dwells in the very depths of our souls. And that, Paul said, is how you are to relate to each other throughout your journey. The fact of the matter is that the church has changed over and over again since the days that Paul wrote that letter. From being house churches that were loosely connected to other house churches, and Paul would write letters to them and try to keep them mindful that there were disciples in Jerusalem, and they needed to remember that the disciples told how it was with Christ, and they needed to lead that way too. But 300 years later, when the Roman emperor decided that the most expedient way to unify his empire was to take the newfound faith that he had in Jesus Christ and turn it into a major institution, and actually turn it into more than that, because it became the Holy Roman Empire. And the minute it became an institution, it changed. And it changed forever, and not necessarily always for good. All of a sudden, with the new Holy Roman Church, baptism changed on a dime. Where it was a believer's baptism in the New Testament church, that you had to give your heart to Jesus and then be baptized. Now you brought your children to church and got them baptized, because that's the fastest and the quickest way to get them into the system. That's an institutional decision. The church has explained why that can work in the context of faith, theologically, but still, it was a decision of institutional process. The bottom line is this: who and what the church is to be is finally and always not about structure. It is about the essence of why we are here. And that answer, my friends, is not in a church book of order. It's not in a church book of confession. That answer is here. It's in the center of our being. As we, like the children's sermon, ask the question, why are we here? Are we here because someone makes us? Are we here because that's the thing to do in society? Or are we here because what's inside is driving us to join together with other people directed by the Holy Spirit to make a difference in our little worlds and in our big worlds? And in fact, that is why we are here. To let others know what the peace of Christ means when it rules in our hearts and it saves our lives. That's the good news. We have more than institution to offer. We have Jesus Christ at the center of our being. Let us make that known. Not that we're Presbyterians out there in the world, but that we indeed are those who have Christ at our center, showing His grace, His love, His peace, His mercy and salvation for all time. Amen. Let us stand and say,